I'm Christopher Taylor, and the following is a presentation of my research on student speech safety and the Confederate flag in public schools. Each of the examples shown here reflects an incident of racial intimidation reported in a Pennsylvania high school. In an administrator's eyes, any of these might present a serious disruption to the learning environment, but school leaders also have to consider students' freedom of expression. To prevent racial intimidation, several schools throughout the country have sought to ban displays of the Confederate flag. This project will investigate whether such bans are constitutional by examining a policy passed recently in Durham, North Carolina, and consider whether a similar policy would be constitutional in the rural Pennsylvania school district of St. Mary's. In September of 2017, shortly after the violent Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, the school board of Durham Public Schools passed a revision to its student dress code policy that prohibited clothing that might intimidate other students on the basis of race, including the Confederate flag. According to board member Natalie Bayer, the board voted for the policy change with the recent violence in Charlottesville in mind, as well as the debate that had been taking place over the last few years in the South over symbols of the Confederacy after the 2015 mass shooting at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Ms. Bayer also cited a report of over 70 incidents of racial intimidation during the prior school year in neighboring Orange County. In this context of racial tension, the DPS board decided to adopt the policy change. The foundational Supreme Court ruling on student speech is Tinker v. Des Moines, where it was established that students have First Amendment rights in public schools. Schools cannot restrict speech based on a mere fear of a possible disruption or because the speech deviates from the opinion of the majority, but only when it can be reasonably forecasted to create a material and substantial disruption to the operation of the school, or if it impinges on the rights of other students. This raises several important questions about Durham's policy. While Tinker went a long way toward protecting student speech, subsequent rulings have imposed limitations and given administrators more leeway to suppress speech in certain circumstances. In Bethel v. Frazier, the Supreme Court ruled that Tinker is not absolute. Schools have a duty to set the boundaries of appropriate discourse and may prohibit speech that is offensive to others. If seen as a symbol advocating for white supremacy, the Confederate flag can be seen as offensive to some and outside the boundaries of civil discourse. In Morse v. Frederick, the Supreme Court ruled that schools can restrict speech that undermines the mission of the school. In the context of a Confederate flag ban, racial diversity and inclusion can be seen as an important part of a school's mission and thus justify a ban on the symbol. While the Supreme Court has not ruled specifically on school bans of Confederate flags, their decisions on student speech have played a major role in lower court decisions on these policies. There are a handful of lower court decisions upholding these types of policies. In Scott versus the School Board of Alachua County, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals supported the district's ban because they were able to establish a reasonable fear of disruption due to a record of recent racial tension in the district. In addition to the Tinker rationale, the court argued that Frazier gave the district the power to ban the flag as a way of inculcating manners of civility. In several other cases, courts have upheld Confederate flag bans because the schools were able to demonstrate a history of racial incidents that disrupted education, thus meeting the Tinker standard for suppressing speech. While there are several lower court rulings in favor of Confederate flag bans, there have been a few that have struck them down as well. In Castorina versus Madison County School Board, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals found that the school's enforcement of a policy banning clothing that expresses themes of racial intimidation constituted viewpoint discrimination based on the testimony that students who had worn Malcolm X t-shirts were not disciplined. On a different basis, the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of West Virginia in Bragg versus Swanson overturned a principal's revision of the dress code that prohibited the rebel flag. The court ruled that the principal's fear of disruption was not a reasonable forecast because she drew upon experiences from working at other schools in the district instead of the school at which she implemented the policy in question. To apply this analysis to the policy passed by Durham Public Schools, we can look at the legal strengths and weaknesses of the ban. Wisely, the wording of the policy is based primarily upon Tinker's disruption standard, the primary way that courts have evaluated these types of policies. However, these bans have not always been upheld. The wording and rationale for the DPS policy exposes two vulnerabilities. First, there is a fair chance that the stated events that led to the policy change would not constitute a reasonable forecast of a material and substantial disruption, since it is based on events in Charlottesville and Orange County, not events from within the district. This could be problematic if the policy were to be challenged. Secondly, such policies have been overturned when they are perceived to target only one side of an issue. Durham's policy specifies Nazism, the Ku Klux Klan, and the Confederacy, without making reference to the quote, other side of racial tension. While the logic of viewpoint discrimination, accusations within the issue of white supremacy may seem unjustified to many, the courts haven't necessarily interpreted things that way. In order to strengthen their legal justification for the policy, I would recommend the following steps. First, it seems important to document incidents of racial intimidation in DPS so that the ban on Confederate flags will be based on a more reasonable forecast of disruption. Secondly, the district should adopt language in the policy stating their responsibility to establish norms of civil discourse to bring it in line with Fraser. Thirdly, the district's mission includes language on racial and cultural diversity, so advocating for the policy as a way to uphold the district's mission would be supported by the logic of Morse. Fourth, revising the policy to either remove specific symbols or adding a symbol seen as expressing anti-white racism would help avoid charges of viewpoint discrimination. And last, advocating for the policy as a way to protect the rights of other minority students would be supported by Tinker's rights of others prong that was used in Harper versus Poway. In St. Mary's, Pennsylvania, and probably a lot of other districts in the states, the adoption of this policy might seem unnecessary to many. St. Mary's, like many rural districts, is overwhelmingly white with a minority population of only 4%, and displays of the Confederate flag are fairly commonplace. However, some race-based incidents do arise, and it would be easy to foresee problems increasing if there happened to be a future demographic shift in the community. First of all, it's worth noting this may not be the most effective policy a school leader could pursue. Alternatives such as diversity workshops of students through guest speakers or within certain subjects, allowing minority students to organize clubs to voice their concerns, and conducting professional development with teachers might be more effective than a ban on clothing. Secondly, documenting race-based incidents within the school would help justify the need for the policy under the disruption standard of Tinker. Third, drafting the policy based on the recommendations suggested for Durham would be legally sound and allow for administrative discretion in dealing with violations. The use of alternatives and allowing for discretion would likely satisfy a court requirement to narrowly tailor the restriction of First Amendment rights and create the most legally sound restriction of student speech in St. Mary's. In the end, however, my recommendation would be that St. Mary's area, Durham Public Schools, or any other district interested in promoting a culture of equity and diversity should adopt a broader student anti-discrimination policy that would subject symbols like the Confederate flag to discipline only when they have a negative effect on the school environment, while also applying to a wider range of expressions and personal identities. Such a policy would, in my analysis, be more flexible and effective in its broadness, and more legally sound in its flexibility and rationale. In addition to this disciplinary policy, the goal of an equitable education would be best achieved by also promoting diversity education within the school's curriculum and providing professional development that focuses on encouraging teachers' capacity to deal with conflict that may arise among students based on categories of personal identity. This kind of approach would help schools prepare students for participation in our democratic society and help fulfill the mission of public education.